The conference room on the 4th floor of Meridian General smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet and Docker. Elena Cross had been standing at the small wooden podium for 11 minutes without being offered a chair. Degger. Cross. Board Chairman Gerald Whitfield did not look up from the folder in front of him. He was 61, silver-haired. The kind of man who had built a 40-year career on never once raising his voice, because he never needed to. You understand why you're here. I understand what I've been told, Elena said. Her voice was even. It had been even for 11 minutes. You submitted a fellowship credential from an overseas trauma program that this board cannot verify. Whitfield finally looked up. His eyes were the pale gray of a man who had already made up his mind before the meeting started. No transcript. No institutional record. No supervising physician we can locate and contact. In plain terms, Dr. Cross, we have no proof this fellowship happened at all. It happened. Then produce it. Some of it isn't in a filing cabinet, Mr. Whitfield. A small ripple went through the 6 other board members seated along the table. Whitfield allowed himself the thinnest smile. The kind that isn't a smile at all. That's a convenient answer for someone whose competence is currently the subject of a formal review. Elena said nothing. 20 feet away, at the far end of the table, sat Dr. Aaron Voss, the hospital's chief of surgery, who had once called her diagnostic instincts the sharpest I've seen in 15 years of practice, and who now sat with his hands folded and his eyes on the table. Because Whitfield had made it clear, in quieter conversations before this hearing, that supporting her too loudly would not be forgotten at review time. Let me be direct, Whitfield said, closing the folder. This board has reviewed your file. We've reviewed the 2 incident reports from your last rotation where you deviated from written protocol without prior authorization. We've reviewed your credentials, which, again, we cannot verify through any institution this hospital recognizes. And frankly, Dr. Cross, I have serious concerns that this hospital has been carrying a liability we do not fully understand for the better part of 3 years. A liability. A physician practicing beyond what we can confirm she is qualified to practice. That is a liability. That is also, I should add, a legal exposure for every single person in this room, myself included. Whitfield folded his hands. I intend to recommend suspension of your license pending a full external review. Effective today. The word landed the way Whitfield wanted it to land. Flat, procedural, final. Like a door closing on a hinge that had been oiled specifically so it wouldn't creak. Elena's hands did not shake. She had been in rooms far worse than this one. Rooms where the ceiling was a tarp, and the only light was a headlamp clipped to someone's collar. And she had learned a long time ago that stillness was a kind of armor you built quietly, over years, and never advertised. You're suspending me over paperwork. I'm suspending you over the absence of paperwork. There's a difference, and I'd ask you not to conflate the 2 in front of this board. There isn't a difference. Not really. Not when the paperwork you're asking for was never designed to exist in a filing system you have access to. Then perhaps, Whitfield said, you should have chosen a career path that left a more conventional paper trail. A few of the board members shifted, uncomfortable, though none spoke up. I chose the path that let me keep people alive in places where the nearest hospital was a rumor. Elena said, I didn't choose it for the paperwork. Whitfield's patience, thin as it had been, finally ran out entirely. Dr. Cross, I don't know what you did overseas, or where, or for whom, and at this point, given the total absence of verification, I'm inclined to think a great deal of it may be embellishment, intentional or otherwise. What I do know is that this board has a duty to this hospital, to our patients, and to the public, and that duty does not bend for a compelling personal story, however well told. He looked to his left. Motion to suspend. Pending review. Second, said the board member beside him. A man who had not spoken once in 11 minutes and clearly did not intend to start now. Al in. The double doors at the back of the conference room opened without a knock. 2 men walked in wearing Navy service khakis, and the air in the room changed before either of them said a single word. Whitfield's hand, half raised to call the vote, hung there a moment too long. The first man was broad-shouldered, maybe 40, with a weathered calm that comes from a specific kind of experience you cannot fake and cannot train into a person quickly. The second was younger, moved with a slight hitch in his gait that suggested an old injury he'd learned to walk around rather than complain about. Neither of them looked at Whitfield first. Both of them looked at Elena, and something shifted in her posture that hadn't shifted once in 11 minutes of interrogation. "Mom," the older one said, and something in the way he said it, "Not doctor, not Dr. Cross, ma'am." The way you address someone whose rank in a different world outranks the room you're standing in made 3 of the board members sit up straighter without understanding why. Whitfield recovered his composure fastest, which was, after all, his particular skill. "Gentlemen, this is a closed disciplinary hearing. I'll need you to leave." "With respect, sir, I don't think you will." The older man stepped forward and set a single manila folder on the table, not sliding it toward Whitfield, but toward Elena. "Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reyes. This is Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Ibarra." He nodded toward the younger man. "We're both active duty, currently assigned stateside, and we drove 4 hours to be in this room today because a friend of ours saw this hearing was scheduled on a public docket and made a phone call he probably wasn't supposed to make." "I don't see what relevance 2 servicemen have to." "We're here about her," Reyes said, and for the first time his voice hardened, just slightly, the way water hardens right before it freezes. "So give me 2 minutes before you finish that vote, sir. You'll want to hear this before you strike your gavel." Whitfield's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That, in itself, was the first crack in 11 minutes of granite. 3 years ago, Reyes began. "In a location I'm not going to name in an open room, our platoon took casualties that should have been fatal. Should have been, on paper. On any statistic you want to pull up afterward. We lost communications with our supporting element for 6 hours. The nearest surgical capability with the equipment to handle what we were dealing with was over 10 hours out by any conventional route." He looked at Elena. She wasn't 10 hours out. That was the first step. She was forward, deployed with a joint medical detachment. Nobody in this room has clearance to look up. Reyes continued. "And when word came through that we had 2 men critical with no extraction window, she made the call to move to us instead of waiting for us to be moved to her. That's not a decision that's in a textbook, Mr. Whitfield. That's a decision that gets people killed if the surgeon making it isn't exactly as good as she needs to be, every single time, with no margin for a second opinion." That was the second step, and the room had gone very still around it. Ibarra spoke for the first time, quieter, rougher, like a man who didn't enjoy talking about this, but had decided a long time ago that it needed to be said out loud when it mattered. I was one of the 2. He rolled his sleeve up without ceremony, revealing a long, pale scar tracing from his elbow toward his shoulder, The kind of scar that told its own story to anyone who'd seen enough of them to read it. Femoral bleed shrapnel, no blood bank, no OR, dirt floor, and 2 headlamps for light. She had maybe 11 minutes before I was gone for good. She used 9 of them, and she didn't waste a second of the other 2 arguing with anybody about protocol. That was the 3rd step, and it was the one that finally made Dr. Voss, at the far end of the table, go pale and look up. "You want a transcript?" Reyes said, turning back to Whitfield. "You want an institution that will confirm her fellowship. I understand that. I do. On paper, it's a reasonable thing to ask. But the program she trained under isn't listed anywhere. You can search from a hospital administrator's desk, because it wasn't built for that kind of paperwork. It was built for exactly the kind of situation Ibarra just described to you. And every person who ever supervised her in that program either can't be named in an open room or isn't in a position to fax you a transcript on hospital letterhead." He paused, letting that sit. "What I can tell you is that 2 men in this hospital's parking lot right now, both of them fathers, both of them still on active duty, are alive today because a surgeon this board is trying to suspend this afternoon made a call nobody else in that theater would have made, and made it in under a minute." Whitfield's jaw worked, and for a moment nothing came out of it at all. "Sir." Reyes went on, quieter now, the hardness gone out of his voice, replaced by something closer to plain fact, with respect. "I didn't drive 4 hours to negotiate irregularity with a hospital board. I drove 4 hours because a woman who kept my platoon mate's leg attached to his body is being told, in this room, in front of her colleagues, that her competence is a liability. I wanted her to hear, out loud, in front of the people questioning her, that there are men who'd stake their lives on that competence without a second thought. Some of us already have, more than once." Dr. Voss, at the far end of the table, had gone very pale. He was looking at Elena now, really looking at her, the way a man looks at someone he thought he understood and is realizing, all at once, that he'd only ever seen the smallest visible fraction of who she actually was. "Elena Cross," Whitfield said. And for the first time in 11 minutes, plus however long this had now run, his voice had lost its flatness entirely. "Is what these men are describing accurate?" Elena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it wasn't defensive, and it wasn't triumphant either. It was simply tired. In the particular way of someone who has spent a long time being asked to prove things that shouldn't need proving to the people standing closest to her. "I don't talk about the specifics of that deployment, Mr. Whitfield. Some of it's classified. Some of it's just not mine to tell without permission from the men who were there and lived it with me. But yes, it's accurate. All of it. And the 11 minutes, Whitfield said slowly, glancing at the folder still unopened in front of Elena. "The lack of documentation." "There's no documentation because there was no time to document," Elena said. "There was a chest cavity, a femoral bleed, and 2 men who needed a surgeon a great deal more than they needed a paper trail. I made a choice under fire, in the dark, with no backup plan. I'd make the exact same choice again tomorrow if I had to." Nobody at the table said anything for a long moment. Whitfield looked down at the folder Reyes had placed in front of Elena. Inside it, visible even upside down from where he sat, was a single official Department of Defense letter, signed, sealed, addressed to whichever hospital administration required it, confirming under limited, unclassified terms that Dr. Elena Cross had, in fact, served in a forward surgical capacity attached to a naval special warfare element, and that her conduct during that service had been formally commended at the command level. It was not the full story. Whitfield understood, looking at it, that it was never going to be the full story, not in this room, not on this day. But it was enough of it, and it was more than enough to undo 11 minutes of certainty. "This board," Whitfield said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way none of them had heard from him before. "We'll need to review this documentation in full before any further action is taken today." "That's fine," Ray said. "Take your time." "We're not in a hurry anymore, sir." He looked at Elena, and something in his weathered face softened for just a moment, the professional distance dropping away for the length of a single sentence. "Mom, Ibarra's kid turns 6 next month. He wanted you to know that, since we were driving up this way regardless." For the first time since she'd walked into that room 11 minutes. Now closer to 25 minutes ago. Elena Cross's composure cracked, just slightly, just at the corners of her eyes. The way stone cracks under pressure that's been building for far longer than anyone in the room could see. Whitfield cleared his throat. He was a man unused to being wrong, and even more unused to being visibly wrong in front of 6 board members and 2 active duty servicemen who had just walked into his conference room and dismantled a decision he'd been building toward for weeks. "Dr. Cross," he said, "I owe you. I think I owe you an apology I don't entirely know how to give correctly. I made assumptions about the absence of documentation that I should have questioned far more carefully before making them the centerpiece of a public disciplinary hearing." "You did?" Elena said simply. She didn't make it easy for him, and she didn't need to. Some debts aren't hers to forgive on someone else's schedule. "For what it's worth," Whitfield continued, "the motion is withdrawn, effective immediately." He looked to the board member beside him. "Strike the second from the record." "Withdrawn," the man said quietly, already reaching for his pen. Dr. Voss, at the end of the table, finally spoke, his voice rough in a way it hadn't been in 15 years of easy confidence. "Elena, I should have said something an hour ago, when they first brought this up. I didn't. I'm sorry." She nodded once, not unkindly, but not absolving him either. "Some things you let people sit with a while before you hand them peace." Reyes picked up his cover from under his arm, a gesture that read as final, as a man preparing to leave a job he considered finished. "We'll get out of your hospital's hair, Mr. Whitfield. Figured you'd want to review that letter without an audience standing over your shoulder." He turned to Elena one last time, and for a moment the formality dropped entirely. "Mom, good to see you again. Wish it were under better circumstances. You too, Chief. Tell Ibarra's kid happy birthday early." The 2 men walked out the way they'd come in, and the doors closed behind them with none of the theater of their entrance. Just 2 men going back to a life that didn't require anyone's permission or paperwork to validate what it had already cost them and what it had already saved. The boardroom stayed silent for a long moment after they'd gone. Nobody moved to reconvene the vote. Nobody suggested it. 3 weeks later, Meridian General's Trauma Department quietly updated its internal staff directory. Dr. Elena Cross's title had not changed. Her patient load had not changed. What had changed was smaller, and in some ways far more permanent. A hallway conversation here. A resident who no longer hesitated before paging her on a hard case in the middle of the night. A chief of surgery who now made a deliberate point of saying her name in staff meetings when he used to let it pass unmentioned out of caution. Whitfield never publicly addressed the hearing again, but the following month, when a new resident questioned an unconventional call Elena made in the trauma bay, it was Whitfield himself, sitting in on a quality review meeting he had no obligation to attend, who quietly noted that Dr. Cross's judgment had been earned, somewhere most of them would never fully understand, and that the board would do well to remember it before questioning it again. Elena kept the Dao letter from that hearing folded in the bottom drawer of her desk, not because she needed it to prove anything to herself anymore, but because some nights, on the hardest cases, it was worth remembering that somewhere out there were men who would tell you, without a moment's hesitation, exactly what 11 minutes in the dark had been worth to them. She never asked for credit, not once. Not in 3 years since it happened. She never needed a hospital board to understand where she'd been, or what she'd done there to know it herself. But on the rare days when a skeptical colleague or a nervous administrator needed convincing, it turned out the truth had a way of walking through the door on its own timeline, in service cacus, carrying nothing but a folder and a debt it had come a long way, on its own time, to repay in full.